The Serving Library, I'm going to just read shortly this introduction, is a non-profit organization that publishes an online and print journal, also called the Serving Library, maintains a collection of objects and offers public events and programs. The Serving Library runs public programs, usually in the context of the collection. Since 2020, the collection has been hosted in art space called the 019 in Ghent, Belgium. The Serving Library was founded in New York in 2011 by Stuart Bertolotti Bailey and David Reinfurt, who will be today speaking with us, and also Angie Kiefer. The current editorial team is based across New York, Scotland, and Berlin. Together with our guests also include Francesca Bertolotti Bailey and Vincenzo Latronico. I first came across their editorial and design work through magazine. It was a publication that some have called the most important design magazine you've never heard of. It was published between 2000 and 2010, and it was also edited by Stuart, David, and Peter Bilak, who I think some of you may know, who was a frequent guest in Ljubljana. Since then, Stuart and David have been creating their own hybrid practice, something between a traditional design studio, an art platform, and a software company. So in the lecture, through their current and past projects, they will present their unique exploration of the boundaries of design. So welcome again, and give a warm applause.
Hello.
You're on. Should we test the audio?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Aidan, very much, and for the invitation, for the introduction. Can everybody see that all right? If I get in the way of the slides, just wave and I'll move. So we're going to introduce the Serving Library, which is a project which is about 11, 12 years old. So it has a similar kind of span of time to the project that Bill was just talking about. And we've never really done a kind of proper public reflection on what happened over that time. So we thought we'd take this opportunity to do that and really return to that moment 11 or 12 years ago to consider what the ideas, the founding ideas were. They were a very kind of open set of ideas and parameters, and to see how, in fact, they played out over the 12 years since then. And in a way, it's quite surprising what has happened, because life intervenes, the world changes, as Bill was also just saying. But also recently we've kind of realized that what has happened to the various strands of the Serving Library is actually also quite close in a certain sense to what we imagined, just in different kinds of ways. So we're just going to try and follow a few strands. And that's why the talk is called A Skeleton, a Script, or a Good Idea in Advance of Its Realization. So we want to get back to that moment. This is the symbol of the Serving Library. It's a kind of common optical illusion of a book page, which is either folding in on itself or projecting out, depending on your perception. And this seemed a useful symbol to use because we were also kind of thinking of the Serving Library in the beginning in a reversible way, in that it was conceived of as a kind of publishing house, a publisher that is immediately archiving itself in the various ways we'll talk about, and equally an archive that is a catalyst or a set of opportunities for making forms of publishing in a very expanded sense, which might not necessarily look like publishing in the traditional senses of books or digital publishing, but can equally include events or performances, installations. Before we get back to the beginning of the Serving Library, I have to go back 10 years further to the genesis of the whole project, which was the journal that Aiden mentioned, which is called ... So this was started in 2000. It was set up by a small group of graphic designers. It was very much in the beginning by graphic designers for graphic designers. And I would say it was defined in the beginning more by what it wasn't or didn't want to be rather than knowing exactly what it did want to be. So it wasn't particularly commercial. Most of the design magazines at the time were typically sort of portfolio magazines showcasing work, but neither was it intended to be particularly academic, but something in between the two of those things that was based on, in a way, stories of how things were actually made. So it would kind of explore more the backwaters of design. By about the fourth issue, it had kind of left graphic design as a direct subject matter behind and had become just as much about music, literature, film, architecture to some extent. So visual culture and sort of literature in a broader sense. And one thing that started to happen more and more over ... life is that it started to become more performative. And I guess we gradually realized that we were interested in publishing as a subject matter itself, right, as equal to graphic design, as equal to literature or music. But rather than write about that in a kind of obvious, direct, essayistic way, we try and point to aspects of publishing by the ways in which we actually published. And this is, the 9th issue is quite a good example of that, a good summary of that idea. So this is the back cover of issue 9. It's called Elementary Mathematics. And by this point, it was published twice a year. So we were 4 years in. And we started to realize why independent publishing as a kind of economic model is basically unsustainable. Because, especially at this time, it was very difficult to actually get money from anybody who owed us money, which was typically bookstores, distributors, and advertisers. And so we did this little quick article on the back cover, which basically listed all the people who owed us money, which is down there in the bottom right-hand corner, with an explanation of, why we were doing that. I always like to point out that the biggest criminals here were Actar in Barcelona, who owed us something like 7,000 euros at the time, still haven't paid, if anyone from Actar is in the audience with a checkbook. And on the spine, there's like the list of the actual figures. And what was interesting about doing this, and we didn't expect this when we set it up, was that the amount outstanding to us, just over 14,000 euros, was exactly the same as the funding we were getting from the Dutch government. It was initially based in the Netherlands for, I think, 2 years' worth of journals. So it was kind of proving its point that, if we were actually paid, we could become self-sustaining as a project. And so through that experience in particular, we started to kind of look for more ways of doing that in the future. This is the 15th issue, and this was really the beginning of when we started to tie in the development and production of an issue of the journal into a kind of institutional invitation. So this was made on location in Geneva as part of an exhibition called Wouldn't It Be Nice, which was about sort of contemporary art and design practices. And we used quite a significant budget to assemble maybe 8 or 9 contributors in the same space. We were there for about 2 weeks. And the whole issue was produced, edited, proofed, and printed in the space on a set of risograph machines. And it was a particularly self-reflexive issue in that, again, it was pointing to itself and its kind of genesis and its mode of production. That's reflected on the cover, where there's a kind of photograph of 2 stacks of paper, sort of virgin stacks of paper that were there in the space when we arrived. That as we were working and producing, those stacks of paper, of course, went down as we were running through the printing press until they ran out. So what you're looking at is a picture of the kind of raw paper, some of which you're actually holding in your hand at the same time. And that kind of circular self-reflexivity came to infect the journal and its interests more and more as a subject matter. This is a couple of issues later. This issue was based on a series of 3 nights of events in London that were set up to discuss the ways in which words and images were related in public. So each talk was given in a different form. So that might be a conversation, might be a slideshow, might be a kind of photographic essay that gave us the excuse to take each of those different forms of presentation and find some sort of equivalent form to channel them. And this is the last issue of ... So this is 10 years on, the 20th issue, and also has a very self-reflexive cover. This is a small painting by a London-based artist called Philomene Parecki. And it's a small canvas whereby the kind of grey frame that is being built up around the edge of the painting is being made by mixing the 3 primary colors as the painting goes along. So time is very strongly written into this painting, as is the word grey, which is spelled out as a kind of monogram by those very geometric letters. So by this time, after those 10 years, and partly because of this kind of incessant and increasing self-reflexivity, we had an impulse to somehow break the journal and turn it into something else. We'd always been very good at kind of keeping things moving in the sense of both form and content of the journal. And we also had a kind of desire to bring together a few different strands of activity that had grown up around the journal and kind of pool them into one more explicit and more directed project, I guess.
Okay, that directed project is the Serving Library, and that's actually what we're here to talk about and to describe and to put ourselves back in the moment when we were first thinking about the project and imagining what it would be and then taking stock now, 12 years later, of what it actually is. What Stuart just presented was a prehistory and context for understanding already 10 years of independent publishing. Okay, we saw the badge earlier. We saw it as a neon sign. That instinct of the Serving Library was to do exactly the opposite of what was happening with ... It's worth noting that ... was probably at its pinnacle of success when we decided to stop it. That was maybe part of the reason for stopping it, was that it had become a little too easy to be so immediately self-reflexive, but also kind of knockabout or a little bit random in the materials that went in there, which came about through conversations with people we were already artists and writers, designers, whatever, that we were already talking to. So the Serving Library was instead a way to thought to think about how to make this more persistent and how to make it more concrete and self-regulating. So one thing that's important to know is we set up a 501c3, a nonprofit company in the United States, so that we could take donations, which we get very few of, as it turns out, but that was the idea. This is the description of the Serving Library that we put on the first website and used in our initial announcement of the project. And this is what we wanted to go back and kind of interrogate now and see how true or not true it is. So let me just read it, if I can. The Serving Library is a cooperatively built archive that assembles itself by publishing. It consists of 1, an ambitious public website, 2, a small physical library space, and 3, a publishing program which runs through number 1 and 2. So we're going to structure the rest of the talk around these 3 points. I'm going to talk about the website. Stuart is going to talk about the small physical library space and how that manifested, and then I'm going to talk about the publishing program, which kind of de facto runs between all these different pieces. Okay. So first, an ambitious public website. This was 2011. websites were as ambitious as they are now, perhaps. We thought about the website first, and this was important. Was a printed journal first. The serving library, we thought maybe turning it the other way around and releasing material specifically to be read on screens and also then to be printed out and sold. So we publish all the articles that we commission online for free, and then we package them together in journals and sell the journal. Okay. In starting out the serving library, we were also took time to think about how can we make the material immediate, how should we make it available on a screen, and also how can it work the same way on screen and in print. And so we didn't want to have two different formats, but rather we wanted to kind of split the difference between the two because we thought that would give a more particular result. And so there are some qualities of reading on screen that we were identifying. One is, of course, the formats are very different. You read anything from, in 2011, a tiny little phone to a giant monitor. The formats are not consistent on screen, right? The format can be vertical or horizontal. You can scroll, there's infinite scrolling. There is also, if we're thinking about publishing online, we might have immediately thought at this point, in the kind of height of blogs and whatever else, that it would be an infinite scrolling website, which had text and which you read by moving through it. We thought instead that the serving library would kind of double down on the portable document format, on PDFs, which were already quite an old format by this point. There was something we liked about their kind of objecthood and discreteness of PDF. So when we launched the website, here was the ambitious public website. Here's what it looked like. What you see on it, and what we imagined it to be, was a kind of a distributing mechanism. So what you see on the website are 6 PDFs. These PDFs are individual, what we called bulletins. They're meant to be standalone texts. We commission new writing for maybe 75% of them, and we publish existing writing or recontextualize existing writing, sometimes 25% of these. What's important in the bulletin format for us was just that you don't need to know anything else before picking one up and reading it. So if you read one of these PDFs online, you don't need any context. However, just as a kind of mechanism for ourselves, we grouped these collections of bulletins, of PDFs, around a theme. And that was completely different than what we'd done with ... was never themed, and kind of the idea of a theme was a bit anathema, as seemed cheesy and something we would not do. Instead, we decided to embrace that. And so the first issue was gathered around the theme of time. I mean, how much more of a baggy, loose theme could you possibly have? And you see the collection of PDFs here. The one that's in the bottom left corner, I'm going to talk about a little bit more. So if you click on that PDF, you see the first description, the first introduction to it. And this was a bulletin which edited and collected a talk by the science fiction writer Bruce Sterling. It was called The Life and Death of Media. And it was a talk that he'd given in Toronto at a computer conference. It was about exhausted media, dead media. He ran a project at the time called the Dead Media Archive, which collected formats that no longer work. When you click on the image there at the top, it downloads a PDF. That PDF is a multi-page document which has the text of the thing in it, and I'm going to demonstrate how that works in just a second. One thing that was important about this was that the PDF, when you download it, as you'll see in a second, has a timestamp on it. Okay. Then those PDFs, which existed online, we would gather and print in a journal. This is the first issue. I've just opened it up to the first page of the first issue. It has a templated format. It's meant to be read equally on a phone as it is on paper. Here's what the website looks like now. Completely, it looks the same, but it's much better populated by this point. And I'm going to show you just quickly how that works. So here's the serving library website. Every one of these is an individual text. They are grouped together by theme. The most recent theme was the meander, a specific, I'll talk about that later. I'm going to go down and show one of these. I think I'll just show that first one that I already showed. So if I come down here to the life and death of media, I click on this, and then I click here, it will download that PDF and open it up. And then that PDF is individual pages rather than spreads because, of course, it's designed to be read on a phone. The type is big enough where it works on a small screen as well as on a large screen. And then, as I described before, each time you download it, it puts a timestamp from immediately when I download it. So this is the one I just downloaded, so that's today, right now. It's on New York City time, so that's why it's 12:29. If I go at any point onto the website and click here, then that's going to show me a record of all the PDFs that have been downloaded. Now, this is stuff that's already like native to the web server, and it's not so surprising as statistics. But we offer these publicly, and so this is the last one that was just downloaded at 12:29 p.m. And you can see all of the PDFs that have been downloaded. This goes on for kind of a long time. But one thing we realized or thought about or conceptualized from the beginning was with the website with a PDF, the downloading of it creates a copy of that file. So you've just, by choosing to read it, you've participated in the act of publishing. You've just replicated that thing. You've just made another version of it. So this tied into the kind of circular idea of the serving library as both publisher and archiver. Okay, I'm gonna go back to this and we'll, okay.
Okay, so as it says there, the second aspect was a small physical library space. The time at which we began the Serving Library, David and I and the third founder member, Angie Kiefer, were all living in or around New York. And I think when we set up that nonprofit, we had an idea that we would be looking for a space in which to utilize a lot of the publishing, which might have been something like a teaching space or an event space. As I say, ideally permanent and somewhat local. And I'm just going to jump back to what actually happened in terms of the space to halfway through ... live. So this is number 10. You can probably recognize some of the elements from previous covers. This was a best of the first 9, and the cover was a kind of composite best of the first 9 covers. Next slide, please. We launched that issue in Tallinn in Estonia, and Peter, who I was editing the journal with at the time, and myself were doing a week of teaching. And we asked the organizer there, the person who'd invited us, whether he might be able to find us some kind of space to organize an exhibition of objects. And we had this idea because we had a number of objects lying around in the offices where we were working that had appeared at some point as an illustration in an issue of ... And that might have been because we had to scan them to accompany an essay. In some occasions, they might have been an illustration that we'd specifically commissioned, and we still had the original artwork. And we had maybe 10, 15, maybe 20 at most of these, mostly small and quite modest artifacts lying around. So we took them all in a suitcase to Tallinn and made an exhibition of these objects. And in the beginning, it's kind of hard to remember. Maybe it wasn't very clear what the impulse to do that was, but it was something to do with the fact that in the journal ... the images were often very much downplayed. We didn't spend a lot of time and attention photographing things. We often printed black and white. The nature of ... was quite rough in general. And so the idea of the exhibition was to reverse that and to see what happened when you had the actual, the object and the quality of the object in the space. And also what happened when you stripped out the text that was contextualized in the object. What happened when you put these 20 objects in the same space. I often think of that now, having a 4-year-old, as being like putting a bunch of kids in a playground and seeing what happens, what are the relationships that kind of form among them. So here's a typical one. Here's a good example of an object which I often use to give a good example of the sorts of things that were in ... because these items were never usually written about directly, right? There's not many instances of an essayist or a contributor writing, for instance, about an artwork in a direct way. So this is a 12-inch vinyl single cover from about 1980. It's by a British post-punk band called Scritti Politti, and the title of the song is a double A-side, and the title of one of the A-sides was Jacques Derrida. And a scan of this record accompanied a short essay by the German cultural critic Diederik Diederiksen. And what's important about this is that Diederik wasn't writing about the design of the record cover, right? He doesn't even mention it in the text, even though it's quite a distinctive format. Neither was he particularly writing about the music of Scritti Politti, and he really wasn't writing about Jacques Derrida either. What he was writing about was the fact that at this moment in 1980, post-punk music and French deconstructionist philosophy had the same sort of cultural cache, right? And you might be likely to sort of see someone going home on the Underground on London, carrying a record bag and reading French deconstructionist philosophy. And he's basically saying this was the apex of that moment, right? That never happened as much as it did in 1980, and therefore it's represented in form by this mass-produced object. So what's useful then about displaying that object is that it's a kind of portal into that story, right? You can talk about and around that when it's in a physical space, and that's what we ended up doing, as I'll mention. The second object I wanted to show as an example is an early sketch for the London Underground map, which was famously designed by an English designer called Harry Beck. And this image accompanied a piece by a designer and artist called Paul Elliman. The piece was called City Turned Upside Down. And Paul was writing not about the design of the London Underground map or its history, but about the fact that when the Victoria and Albert Museum in London acquired an early sketch from Harry Beck to put in their kind of design classics section, the person installing the sketch installed it upside down, and this went unnoticed for quite a bit of time. And you know, if you know the London Underground map by heart, you can sort of see that it's upside down. And again, Paul wasn't writing about the map in particular. He was writing about the fact that, in a slightly tongue-in-cheek and also slightly serious way, that this was a case for saying that the British could never accept abstract art unless it had a functional premise. So he's making a sort of case that this was a piece of abstract art that kind of made its way into the V&A Museum. So again, it's a kind of lateral reference to the actual object. So here's me taking a photograph of myself in a window reflecting back on the first ever installation of these objects in a funny kind of raw industrial space that looked a bit like a car park. And it was so rough, there was no lighting in the whole building, which isn't that great for an exhibition, right? So what we did is we got two giant sort of industrial strength spotlights and just lit the space from one end of the room. And you actually came in from the far end. So when you came in, you were completely dazzled. And it looked like there was nothing there because of this reason, we could only exhibit things in the direction that the light was projecting. And if you look closely, you can see that Scritti Politti record on the wall and the underground map afterwards. And in that instance, they were just left, pinned into the wall or propped up. This was a few years later, a couple of years later, maybe in Lyon in France. I think originally the idea was just to try and keep that collection of objects moving and also grow it from place to place. And of course, for as long as we kept publishing the journal, we would continue to have excuses for collecting more and more of these artifacts because there would be more and more essays with with images associated. And that's what happened through a kind of snowball effect of touring this round, where's that, Munich in Germany. And this is Porto in Portugal. You can see it's kind of gradually expanding. This is Oslo in Norway. And this is, sorry, I can't see these, Amsterdam and Geneva. And on each occasion, we also took it as an excuse, especially when it was in this kind of very, in a very exhibition-based context, to rearrange the objects based on different logics every time. Sometimes we did that, sometimes we did it as a kind of workshop with other people or with a curator, and also to try and caption what this thing was in different ways. So sometimes we'd have a literal caption on the wall, sometimes we'd have a voiceover, sometimes we'd have video accompanying it, because it's a very difficult thing as an exhibition to convey to people what it is and what is interesting about it, because it is just this surface of, I guess at this point, about 50 or 60 stories that lie behind each of those pieces. Now, by this point, we're well into the kind of serving library period, and ... has stopped. And we continued this very much as an active strand of the serving library in parallel to the publishing through the website and through the printed journal. And as you can see, this is now no longer particularly a small physical space. I mean, this is quite a big physical space. And this was the first time we'd ever utilized that collection and the journals in a kind of concerted educational or pedagogical situation. So this was at the Banff Centre, which is a kind of temporary residency centre in the Canadian Rockies. And as well as being invited to do a 6-week summer school there, we were also offered a big exhibition space, the Walter Phillips Gallery. So we set up this version of the serving library as a space, as a productive space, with the objects on the wall, and we ran a seminar class in there, 3-hour seminar class every morning for about 5 or 6 weeks. Then moving on, this is in New York, artist space, back in a gallery. This is also in New York. It's at the Goethe Institute Library. And then this is in Liverpool in the UK, where I'd moved to at this point. And this is in the Tate at Liverpool, so a kind of giant exhibition space. Whereas you can imagine with a museum as kind of public-facing as the Tate, we had to make a very particular effort in this case to communicate to a very broad public what it was. The crazy architecture that you see the collection installed in here was a hangover from a previous exhibition and was a kind of an architecture of slopes that was designed by an architect called Claude Perron, who's since passed away, and we just kept that format and hung the objects in them. And that the excuse of getting them to Liverpool was essentially to try and set up a permanent, or what turned out to be a semi-permanent space in an old shipping building in Liverpool. So this is the only time we've ever actually had something like a permanent space that itself only lasted for about 1.5 years before we got kicked out. And this is the interior of that one. In that space we held, various classes with different schools, come in, spend in a week or a few days, and also talks and events. And David will show you some images of that later. This is also in Liverpool, just to kind of plough through all of the different formats. Also in Liverpool, in a bigger exhibition space that we ran concurrent with the Liverpool Biennial. And this was the last one in the UK in a University Art Gallery in Nottingham. And finally, or nearly finally, on to Ghent in Belgium, where it's kind of currently under the auspices of a group of artists who run the Kunsthal in Ghent and a kind of satellite space called O19. They had this nice little garage space that they hadn't used and invited us to take up a sort of indefinite installation in there. So they kind of built out this space specifically for us. That happened right on the cusp of lockdown, and in the 2-3 years since, they've actually kind of managed moving even their version of that around Belgium and France and the Netherlands. They designed a set of modular walls which could easily fit into a truck, and they've been able to, in a very nimble way, kind of drive that around Europe. And this is where it currently exists, back in Ghent, but not at O19, but at somewhere called the Design Museum. You can't access it here, which is why all the information's on the window, and is kind of captioned in a way by a small video that you can hear if you put your ear up to the glass. I'll just finish with a final example of one of those objects, just to kind of reiterate the way in which those objects qualify to get into the collection. So this is the cover of a bulletin by the French sociologist and philosopher Bruno Latour. It's about something called the Berlin key, which is a very specific symmetrical, or almost symmetrical key that was used during a particular period in Berlin that kind of forced the tenant of a particular type of apartment in Berlin and the owner of the apartment into a kind of security relationship where you have to insert your key into the lock to open it, but can only retrieve the key by going around the other side of the door and locking it again. So it kind of forces you to lock the door. A very smart technology. We asked one of our regular illustrators, Chris Evans, who's a British artist, to do an illustration to accompany the piece. And Chris, as usual, didn't do a kind of straight depiction of it, but sent back an image which he called Berlin Key Mangled, which is, as if it's been run over by a truck, but it's symmetrically mangled in exactly the same way on both sides. And this is the original airbrush painting that then qualified to go into the collection. So it's there in Ghent with the rest of the stuff.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the third part of this statement. So the Serving Library is a cooperatively built archive that assembles itself by publishing. It consists of a website, a small physical library space, and number 3, a publishing program which runs through numbers 1 and 2. Okay. A lot of times what we do gets lopped under the kind of nomenclature, title, or whatever of independent publishing. We have run this journal, ran for 10 years, and this is run for going on 12 years now. And yes, in some ways it is independent publishing, but it's actually, I think that gets it immediately the wrong way around, because I would say it's much more a case of dependent publishing. Every issue that we've made with some, almost every issue, we've made in cooperation with an institution or a context. And these invitations both pragmatically fund the journal, but they also give us a way to determine what we include in it. So I'm going to show you a few of those and just describe some of the activities that go on, in addition to publishing the journal and making the PDFs on the website, editing the text, commissioning the text. Some of the publicity events and the exhibitions which tie into these things, because in looking back after 12 years, it seems fairly clear that these set of kind of outside para-publishing activities are very much the publishing program of what the Serving Library does. Okay, so this is the first issue. The photograph on the front, it was themed around time. That's why it's got the big time. That's a photograph of a clock in the Chrysler building on 42nd Street in New York City. This issue came initially out of an invitation, a Frieze Projects invitation for the Frieze Art Fair, to Shannon Ebner, who invited us to collaborate with her. And we commissioned a text by Angie Kiefer, the third founding member of the Serving Library. Angie wrote an expansive, amazing text called An Octopus in Plan View, which is an 8-part, sprawling, long bulletin about the anatomy of an octopus. That's the cover of the octopus. Happens to look like an asterisk, you might realize. Here is an opening spread of An Octopus in Plan View. Along with that project, at the Frieze Art Fair, we designed and built a small recording studio, which is built out of cinder blocks, which is something that Shannon was working with at the time, but it's also in the exact shape and size of the cabin in Walden, Henry Thoreau's cabin where he went to retreat from the world. This cabin in the midst of the art fair was sealed, and what it was a recording studio. It was acoustically sound on the inside, and during the run of the Frieze Art Fair, Angie Kiefer was finishing the text and submitting them sending them to Frieze, where they were being recorded, spoken by Mason Lever Yap, who we see here in the recording booth. She read Angie's texts. Then those sound files were sent back to New York, where Stuart and I were, edited, and then collected together, and we had an event at the top of the Chrysler Building, on the next to top floor of the Chrysler Building, where we gathered a small community of kind of people who were interested and played the audio from An Octopus in Plan View. It was about an hour of audio. I'm going to play just the very beginning of that right here.
An Octopus in Plan View.
Well, maybe I am.
Part 1.
I don't have sound.
The etymology of the word octopus.
I'm going to go back 1 second. Can you turn up the sound? Try again.
An Octopus in Plan View. Part 1. The etymology of the word octopus. Octopus, noun. A mollusk with 8 sucker-bearing arms, a soft sac-like body, strong beak-like jaws, and no internal shell. A taxonomic genus within the family Octopodidae. Origin Greek, from octo, meaning 8, plus pus, meaning foot. Plural, debatable.
Okay, so
the word migrated to English.
I'm going to end it there. This event, which was a small group of people committedly listening to the same thing in a small room, this act of publishing was very much in line with our kind of ethos at the time and continuing from that. I'm going to show a number of other issues that were connected with other institutions. This is the 3rd issue of the Serving Library. This was produced in coordination. It was produced as the exhibition catalog for an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York called Ecstatic Alphabets and Heaps of Language. This was an exhibition that brought together artists who were working with typography. We were invited into the show as artists in the exhibition, and what we counter-proposed to them was to make an issue of the Serving Library, which would serve as a catalog for the exhibition. And we would edit that, and it would have text around typography. This is the cover of that issue. A lot of the times, these situations actually help generate the text as well. And so in this case, the first bulletin in this issue was called and it was by Andrew Blum, and it was a text about the redesign of the MoMA Gothic typeface. You can see very subtly a difference between the M and the M. It's a very small distinction. Here's the opening of that piece. In the actual exhibition, we made work to point to the catalog. So here is a view in the exhibition. It's about 13 artists or something like that in the exhibition, I think. What we made was a animated piece which was on the wall. And we called that a trailer for an exhibition catalog. Because the exhibition catalogs, as part of our project, we asked them to print many more than we usually print. Usually we print 1,500. We asked the Museum of Modern Art to print 5,000, and to have them in the bookstore, and to have them in the most prominent place in the bookstore, which was only doable because it was an art project. And so they said yes, this kind of obscure publication. And so what we did in the exhibition was then to point down to the bookstore by making what we called an exhibition trailer, a trailer for an exhibition catalog. And I want to play just a little bit of this first piece, which ran on that screen. I'll just note that this was an excuse as well to develop this typeface and the animation that goes with it. It's meant to incentivize a viewer to the exhibition to actually go downstairs and buy the catalog. Okay. Here's the issue, which we wanted them to sell it for $1, but MoMA could not stomach that. Apparently that wouldn't go into their bookstore back of house system. So we settled on $5, which still is quite cheap for an exhibition catalog. And then we insisted it goes right up on the front desk. And in fact, for a while it went on the front desk and it didn't sell because it's like a dense little book of like obscure texts about typography. But then we had them. Then they put on a big giant $5 sticker. And by the end of the exhibition, this is like the one issue of the magazine which we printed 5 times more than we usually do, which we sold, which we couldn't find anymore. We had sold out. We recently found a few. But okay. Next issue I want to describe. This is number 7, and as each one was gathered around a theme, this is gathered around the theme of numbers. This was the numbers issue, and this came out of a project, actually a project for the Venice Biennale that year, where we had redesigned a scoreboard. This was the Lithuanian and Cypriot pavilion. We had redesigned, like made a chip that went in the scoreboard and changed the way it displayed the time. As it turns out, on the opening night, we were doing a talk, and we ran too long, spoke too much, and we missed the dance party that happened at the opening afterwards. We were too embarrassed to go in because we'd missed the entire opening, and then they shut the doors and had this lock-in dance party that was apparently epic, and we missed it. And all our friends came out and said, "You are so lame for to miss this dance party." And somebody thoughtfully made a video at the end of it, which I'm going to play here. Turn up the sound if you want. This is the way the clock animated, and it just played through a series of big zeros and small zeros. Okay, so we were very sad to have missed that party. We had an invitation right afterwards to the Contemporary Art Center in Vilnius in Lithuania. And there we decided we would take this existing lapse and try to get back in time. We did the exhibition 1 year later after the Venice Biennale, and we decided we'd frame this exhibition around trying to get back to that one moment in time, to this party that we missed. And we installed installed a number of pieces, some of our work, a lot of not our work, in the space. And we recreated those, what we called shot clocks, those clocks which did the 0-0 animation. And we convened an event on the evening of the summer solstice, June 21st, where Stuart stood on one end of this courtyard and I stood on the other end of this courtyard, and we recited poetry back to each other. It was a poem that we had written together, and which talks about the Venice Biennale, and it was quite... and we played some music, interrupted it for some rather serene music. And the entire event, we described it as kind of a seance or a kind of time travel moment. We had a piece of music, which then the poem ended and was intended to kind of peak at midnight on the summer solstice, where this piece of music that we had made played again. It lasted about 20 minutes, and you're supposed to go in your mind to kind of occupy the moment when the... anyway, occupy the music and get back to Venice. It happened. We got back, so that was good. Okay, next issue. You might notice this is half the size of the previous issues of the Serving Library. At some point, we decided we wanted to print in color, but in order to print in color, we needed to reduce this trim size by half, so because of the way money works. And so this was the 10th issue, which we did as a kind of retrospective of the first 9 issues. And with that issue, we decided also, Serving Library, as a nonprofit organization, we thought we would have a gala, right, to raise money. We did this, and this is when we had the space in Liverpool. And this was in 2016, we staged the Serving Library Christmas Gala, which included music. Here's an image of the space on that evening. We had a two-woman percussion outfit called Rattle, played for the event. We had several different things going on. I did a talk about algorithms and card tricks with Angie Kiefer, which we see behind us here. And people came and drank and pretty much didn't give us any money, but the event was fun. But I think this would qualify as a kind of form of publishing. Okay. Next one I want to describe is the Serving Library Annual. This was issue number 15. We made this together with Cukrarna Editions in Mantova in Italy, the publishers of Bruno Minori, artist and designer. Munari had published this book, Codice Ovvio, or Obvious Code, and it had never been translated into English, and we thought this was a real tragedy. And we managed, Coraini was nice enough to allow us to translate it, and in cooperation for the rights, then they get the translation that we made after the fact. Also, a fourth member of the Serving Library had joined by this point, or two new members, Francesca Bertolotti Bailey and Vincenzo Latronico. Vincenzo's a translator, and he's an Italian novelist. For this issue, we reproduced pages from Codice Ovvio at their normal size, and then commissioned new writing, which happened in the margins around the original. So everything that happens in the margins, a new text that has to do with the original Munari text. The Munari text is in English. In order to launch this, we did an event in New York at Andrew Krepp's gallery, which was we gathered a series of readers who performed Bruno Munari's poems from this book against his direct light projection works. It's my daughter on the end reading these. Okay. Okay. Almost to the end here. This is the second to most recent issue. This is issue number 16. This is the Serving Library Objects issue. This was a issue which we made with 019 Ghent when they took our collection for an indefinite amount of time. This issue just has each piece in the collection. There are about 100 and so objects at this point. And then a little excerpt of the text from which it originated. So here we see, this is a German license plate and came from a text around the typeface that's on there. This is a poster for an imaginary university. This is the piece of sheet music for a piece by Steve Reich called Clapping Music. Now, 019, as Stuart started to describe, toured the collection. And they toured it to a series of spaces, and in each space, they inevitably held more than one public programs. This is during COVID. We did not attend any of these programs, except for by Zoom at least one. Here's an image in Antwerp of the space opened up with the collection installed in it. Here's Valentine Goethals from the 019 running the thing. Here you see a person in the space. And what we started to realize from these kind of ancillary activities was that physical space that we imagined it's like some static thing that just held the collection and lasted and people came in and occupied. We realized it was this itinerant thing that actually was de facto working very much as we had imagined it at the beginning. Okay, finally, the most recent issue we did together with the Clark Art Institute in Western Massachusetts for a two-person show, two-artist show. It was around the theme of the meander. And one of the bulletins in there was a piece about Giuseppe Piano, an Italian mathematician who described a particular curve. This was a piece by Tauba Auerbach, who is an artist in the show and also a regular contributor to the Serving Library. Now, for this, as the way this issue was produced, it was also produced as a kind of third object in the show. So it was a catalog for the exhibition, and we used that prompt to organize 13 texts around the theme of the meander. Here's an installation view of it. Here's a copy of the exhibition catalog, which is not really an exhibition catalog, but in the show. Okay. There's one last part.
Okay, so there's a kind of PS that isn't either of those 1, 2, or 3 points in the description. This is something that it's called black whiskey for reasons I'll mention in a minute. And why it seems useful to tack this on at the end was because initially, and we tend to forget this ourselves, the idea of the Serving Library, and part of the reason it was called the Serving Library was that we always intended it to be a space for drinking as much as reading. Right, so in a way it was supposed to be a sort of intellectual bar. And I think when we had imagined that as some sort of more permanent space in or around New York, that was definitely what we had in mind. Next slide. And at some point in the sort of second half of ... we'd recently met someone called Christoph Keller, who had founded a publishers called Revolver in Frankfurt and had published for about 10 years, published about 400 books, I think. And we met him at the point where he was selling revolver, which by all accounts was very successful, and move into the middle of nowhere in Germany with his family to basically give it all up. He'd become disillusioned with publishing and with the art world, and particularly the conflation of those two. So we did an interview with him on the farm that he ended up buying with his family. And when he bought that farm, he didn't know this in the beginning, but it came with a working still, a small distillery in a barn. And he looked into this and realized that a lot of the farms in that area distill alcohol because they can effectively pay off a proportion of their taxes by doing so and selling to the government in a highly subsidized way. And in order to keep the license, he had to basically distill within about 2 years. So he learned, he's an incredible autodidact, he learned to become a distiller very quickly. We did an interview with him for an issue of ... It was a kind of typical ... interview, where we went to the farm, interviewed him specifically about the similarities and differences between publishing and distilling, right? Of which there are many, because both of them are essentially taking a raw material, processing it into a product, right? So that's what the interview is about. We also invited him to New York to do a talk in the space that we had there at the time. And he talked about the farm to an audience, passed around bottles of the schnapps that he started making. And within a couple of years, he was winning kind of silver and gold medals, you know, within the distilling industry, and sort of became, in a certain sector, fairly well known, and carried on doing that for about the same amount of time that he was publishing books. So he just sort of swapped one industry for another industry. Because we were interested in continuing that discussion, we invited him to we asked if he would be willing to make, in collaboration with us, a whiskey. The reason for this was just we like whiskey. We happened to be doing a residency in Scotland at the time, in Edinburgh. And he was doubtful about it because of the nature of the water in Germany, but he was game. He agreed to go ahead. And he managed to find a perfect source of water in the middle of the Black Forest. Right, so partly because it was in the Black Forest, and partly because we were interested in sort of producing it and selling it through a kind of black market system, that's why we called it black whiskey, which now seems a very bad mistake, right? So one of the things that we were interested in making a whiskey was that we wanted to make something that was plausible, a decent drink, and we figured that minimum 12 years was about what we would think of as acceptable. So we decided to make a 12-year whiskey. And part of the reason that interested us was because of the slowness of that production, right? I mean, slowness in relation to what we normally do, publishing, making books, doing graphic design. Now, because Christoph was obviously going to be doing the publishing part, that left us with, you know, what's our half of the deal. So we decided that our work would be to market it effectively, but also to raise the funds in order to produce it. So we decided to sell shares in advance of the production. And in order to sell the shares, we made a particular form, a piece of work, which is what you see here. We produced that in the letterpress room using, you know, old letterpress technology. And we didn't print it in the end, we debossed it. So you can only read it when you have slanting light reading across the text. And as well as trying to circulate that as an advert to try and attract people to invest in the whiskey, which we did in various publications, including on the back cover of an issue of ... We also made this form and as a kind of certificate that anyone who would invest in anything between 1% to 10% shares in the production would get one of these certificates. It was effectively like an edition. There were maybe 40 of them that we made, with the requirement that 12 years later, when the whiskey was ready, they would have to exchange that in order to receive the whiskey that they were due. And as it happens, this year is 12 years later, and that's the whiskey that we launched in Berlin back in June. And I just wanted to end on that image because, of course, what you're looking at there is some liquid that has taken exactly the same amount of time to mature as the serving library has up until this point. So you're kind of looking at something that has been there for as long as all of the slides that we've been showing tonight. And I think that's the end.